I stood in my son's driveway with 2 suitcases, and my late husband's recipe box clutched against my chest, and I watched the porch light click off while I was still standing there. Not flickering. Not a bulb dying. Son's finger on the switch, on purpose, while my own grandchildren's bicycles lay tipped over in the grass behind me. I didn't bang on the door. I didn't cry out. I picked up the box, set it on top of the suitcase, and I said 3 words out loud to nobody but the dark. Watch me now. My name is Eleanor and I'm 61 years old, and 18 months ago I would have told you I had a good life. Not flashy. I drove a 2014 Buick with a heated seat that only worked on the passenger side, and I lived in a townhouse in Barrie, Ontario, that I'd shared with my husband Walter for 22 years, before the cancer took him in 4 months flat, faster than any of us brace for. I'm not going to dwell on those 4 months. People who've lost someone know what that kind of time does to you, and people who haven't won't understand it no matter how I describe it, so I'll just say this. By the time Walter died, I had used up every bit of strength I thought I had, and I genuinely believed the worst was behind me. It wasn't. Walter and I had 1 child, our son Dominic. He was 34 when his father passed, married to a woman named Priscilla, with 2 kids of their own. Mace was 8, and Tilly, who was 5. Dominic worked in commercial insurance, did well for himself, owned a 4-bedroom house in a newer subdivision outside the city, with a 2-car garage and a basketball hoop bolted over it. Priscilla didn't work outside the home. She had what she called a lifestyle brand on Instagram that, as far as I could tell, mostly involved photographing candles. I'm not bitter about that. I want to be clear about that part. I liked Priscilla fine, for years. She made my son happy, mostly, and she was a decent enough mother to those 2 kids, in her own particular way. What I'm bitter about, and I think I'm allowed to be, after everything, is what happened 6 weeks after Walter's funeral, when the life insurance check still hadn't cleared. And the townhouse mortgage was eating through my savings faster than my part-time hours at the medical clinic could replace it. I called Dominic and asked if the kids and I— Wait, no. There were no kids. It was just me. I asked Dominic if I could stay with them for a little while. Just until probate sorted itself out, until the house sold, until I had my feet back under me. I wasn't asking for charity. I had money coming. I just needed a bridge to get there. The way you need a bridge to get there when grief has hollowed out your judgment and your bank account at the same time. There was a long pause on the line, the kind of pause where you can practically hear someone doing math in their head. Then Dominic said, "Mom, it's just. Priscilla's been talking about turning the guest room into a yoga studio. Can I call you back?" He called back 2 days later and said it wasn't a good time. Said the kids' schedules were chaotic. Said Priscilla was feeling overwhelmed. I want you to understand something about my son's house. It has 4 bedrooms. Mason and Tilly each have their own. There's a guest room that at the time had a treadmill in it that hadn't been used since approximately 2019 and a yoga mat still in its plastic wrapping. There was, in other words, room. There was more than room. There was a finished basement with a wet bar that Dominic used twice a year for the Super Bowl. I drove over anyway. I don't know what I was thinking. Maybe that hearing it from him face to face would be different than hearing it on the phone. Maybe that seeing me standing there with actual suitcases would soften something. Priscilla opened the door first. She had her phone in her hand, the way she always did. And she looked at the suitcases before she looked at me. "Eleanor," she said. She'd called me Mom for 12 years and somewhere in those 6 weeks it had quietly downgraded back to my first name. "This really isn't the best time. We're going through a lot with the kids' schedules. Priscilla, I have nowhere else to go tonight. Have you tried Margaret?" My late sister-in-law, who I hadn't spoken to in 3 years over an unrelated falling out. "Or what about a hotel for a few nights? We can help with that financially if you need." They offered me a hotel. My son's wife stood in the doorway of a house my husband had helped them with the down payment on, and offered to pay for a Holiday Inn, instead of letting me sleep in a room with a treadmill in it. Dominic came up behind her then, and I watched my son's face do something complicated, something I recognized, because I'd seen it on Walter's face 100 times when he was trying to avoid a fight he knew he'd already lost the moral high ground on. "Mom, it's not that we don't want you here. It's just, the kids have a routine, and Priscilla's been under a lot of stress, and we just bought the cottage this summer. and money's tighter than people think. They had just bought a cottage, a second property, on a lake 2 hours north with a dock and a pontoon boat, while I stood on their porch with my husband's recipe box and nowhere to sleep. "I just need a few weeks," I said, and I heard my own voice crack on the word "wicks," which I hated, because I didn't want to give either of them the satisfaction of watching me come apart. That's when Mason appeared in the hallway, behind his parents. 8 years old. In his pajamas, looking confused about why Grandma was standing outside with suitcases instead of coming in for the cookies I usually brought. He started toward the door, and Priscilla turned around fast and said, "Mason, go finish your show, sweetie, this is grown-up stuff," and physically steered him back down the hall by the shoulders. That was the part that did it. Not the hotel offer, not the cottage. The sight of my grandson being steered away from me like I was a problem to be managed before he could ask too many questions. Dominic said, "I'm sorry, Mom, we just can't right now." And Priscilla reached past him and pushed the door shut. Not slammed, that would almost have been better, would have felt like passion instead of policy. Just pushed it shut quietly, deliberately, the way you close a door on a salesperson you've already decided isn't worth your time. And then, because apparently the universe wasn't finished, the porch light clicked off above me while I was still standing there in the dark, suitcases at my feet, 61 years old, 8 weeks a widow. I picked up my bags. I didn't cry. That came later, alone in the Buick, parked in a Tim Hortons lot. 2 exits down the highway, where I sat with the heater running on the one side that worked and cried until I physically couldn't anymore. But on that porch, I just stood there for one more second in the dark and said it. Quiet. To nobody. Watch me now. I'm going to skip past the worst of it, the way you skip past the worst parts of any real story, because this isn't really a story about how bad it got. It's about what came after, but I'll tell you the shape of it, briefly. There were 6 weeks in a long-stay motel off Highway 11 that smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and cost more than I wanted to admit to anyone. There was a stretch where I ate a lot of toast. Because toast is cheap. And you can convince yourself it's a meal if you put enough peanut butter on it. There was a night I sat on the edge of that motel bed and went through Walter's recipe box, just to touch something of his, and found a card in his handwriting for tourtière that made me laugh and sob at the exact same time, which I didn't know a person's body could do simultaneously until that moment. What I want to tell you about is what came after the motel. I'd worked at that medical clinic part-time for 9 years, front desk, scheduling, insurance billing, the unglamorous machinery that keeps a doctor's office running. My manager there was a woman named Joelle, sharp as a tack, the kind of person who notices things and doesn't make a show of noticing them. She clocked pretty quickly that something was wrong. That I was coming in 40 minutes early and staying late, and that I'd started keeping a toothbrush in my desk drawer. She finally just asked me straight out, over coffee in the break room, what was going on. I told her. All of it. The townhouse, the funeral, the porch light. Joelle didn't say she was sorry, which I appreciated more than sympathy at that point. She said, "We've got a full-time billing coordinator position, opening up in 3 weeks. Benefits. It's yours if you want it." I started crying right there in the break room over a stale pot of coffee, and she just patted my shoulder businesslike and said, "Don't make this weird, Eleanor, just say yes." I said yes, with full-time pay and benefits, and once probate finally cleared and the townhouse sold. For frankly, more than Walter and I had ever thought it was worth, which felt like one small mercy he'd left behind without meaning to. I found a 1-bedroom apartment in a building near the clinic, on the 2nd floor, with a balcony, just big enough for 2 chairs and a small herb planter. The carpet was the color of weak tea, and had clearly seen better decades. But it was mine. I signed the lease in my own name, alone, for the first time in 36 years, and I sat on the floor of that empty apartment that first night, with a glass of wine from a box, and felt something I can only describe as terrifying and wonderful at exactly the same time. I want to be honest about the part of this that surprised even me. I didn't fall apart the way I expected to. Grief had already taken everything I had to give in those 4 months with Walter. What was left after the porch and the motel and the toast wasn't despair. It was something flintier, something I didn't know I still had at 61. The divorce. Wait, there was no divorce. I'm sorry, let me say this properly. There was no formal legal battle here, But there was a financial one, and I want to walk you through it because I think some of you watching will recognize it. Walter's estate had been left to me outright, but it turned out, and I only learned this 8 months in, through a conversation I overheard at a family gathering I shouldn't have been invited to but was, out of guilt, by Dominic's aunt, that Dominic had, in the 2 years before his father's death, repeatedly asked Walter for loans toward the cottage, the basketball hoop, a luxury SUV for Priscilla, money that was never written down anywhere, never repaid, and that Walter, who I now understood had been quietly bailing our son out for years without telling me, because he didn't want me to worry, because that was Walter, generous to a fault and allergic to conflict, had simply absorbed as the cost of keeping the peace. When I found this out, something in me went very calm and very clear. I hired an estate lawyer, a steady, unhurried man named Whitfield who'd been recommended by a woman at my church, and I asked him one simple question. Was there any paperwork, any documentation at all, of these loans? There wasn't, which meant, legally, they were gifts, fully absorbed into Walter's estate years ago, fully accounted for, fully mine to do with as I pleased going forward. Dominic had no claim to a cent more than what Walter's will already specified. And Walter's will, written 9 years earlier when our relationship with Dominic and Priscilla was warmer, had left Dominic a modest sum. Modest, not nothing, and left the bulk of everything else to me. I am not a vindictive woman. I want that understood. But I will tell you that there is a particular kind of clarity that comes from realizing the people who closed a door on you in your worst moment had, for years, been quietly taking and taking and taking from the very man whose death put you on that porch in the first place. I didn't sue my son. I didn't need to. I simply finally stopped offering. 10 months after the porch, Priscilla reached out. A long message, the kind that takes someone 20 minutes to compose, full of phrases like, "We've been doing a lot of reflecting, and that was such a hard time for all of us. And we hope you understand where we were coming from." I read it twice, standing on my own balcony, with my own herbs growing in a planter I'd bought with my own first full-time paycheck, and I thought about the porch light clicking off above me in the dark. I wrote back something short. I said I appreciated her reaching out. I said I needed more time. I have not rushed that timeline, and I'm not going to apologize for that to anyone, including the people watching this who might think I should be more forgiving by now. Forgiveness, I've come to believe, isn't owed on anyone else's schedule but your own. Dominic called around the same time the lawyer's letter about the will went out. Funny how that works. And tried to talk about starting fresh. I let him talk. When he was finished, I told him I loved him. But because I do, he is still my son, and that doesn't simply evaporate. But that loving him and trusting him with my well-being were two different things, and that I was working on the first one and not currently interested in the second. He didn't have much to say to that. A year after the porch, Joelle put my name forward for office manager. Full clinic, 4 doctors, a staff of 11. The salary jump made me actually sit down at my kitchen table when I saw the number on the offer letter. Not because it was extravagant, it wasn't. This is Ontario Healthcare Admin, not Wall Street. But because it was the first time in my adult life that a number that large had ever had my name on it and nobody else's. Not Walter's. Not a joint account. Mine. Earned. Documented. Nobody's permission required. I moved into a 2-bedroom about 14 months after the porch. Slightly newer building, better light. A proper second bedroom that I painted a warm sage green and filled with a daybed. And Walter's old armchair, the one piece of furniture from the townhouse I couldn't part with. I told myself the second bedroom was for guests in general. If I'm honest with you, it was for Mason and Tilly, in case there ever came a day they were old enough to ask their own questions about why Grandma disappeared from their lives for a while, and old enough to want an answer that wasn't filtered through their mother. That day came 16 months in. Mason, who'd be turning 10 that fall, had apparently been asking Dominic persistently why he never saw me anymore, why the cookies stopped, why I wasn't at his school's family showcase the way I'd always been. Dominic brought him to my apartment on a Saturday, alone, without Priscilla, and Mason walked in and looked around at my little sage green guest room and said, with the brutal honesty only an almost 10-year-old can manage, "Your apartment is way smaller than our house." "It is," I told him. "Are you poor now?" "No, sweetheart, I'm just starting over. There's a difference." He thought about that with the kind of seriousness kids reserve for things they're trying very hard to understand. Then he said, "Mom said you didn't want to live with us because you were mad." I crouched down to his level the way I used to, when he was tiny and scared of thunderstorms, and I said, "I wasn't mad, Mason. I was sad, and I needed help, and sometimes the people we love most aren't ready to give us the help we need, even when they want to be. That's not your fault, and it's not really anyone's fault. It just is what it is sometimes." I didn't say more than that. He's a child. He doesn't need the ledger of cottage payments and porch lights. He needs to know his grandmother loves him and is in fact fine. He looked at the daybed in the guest room and asked if it could be his bed when he stayed over. I told him absolutely. He has stayed over 4 times since then. Tilly's come twice. Dominic drops them off and picks them up, and we are, slowly, rebuilding something. Not what we had before. That particular shape of family is gone, and I've made peace with that. But something new, something with clearer boundaries, something I had a hand in designing this time instead of just absorbing whatever shape everyone else needed me to take. Priscilla and I are civil. We are not close. I don't think we ever will be again. And that's all right. There's a version of this story where I'd tell you I forgave everyone, completely, and we're one big happy family again, with the cottage and the basketball hoop. And I could tell it to you that way if it would make for a tidier ending. But I'd be lying, and I told myself on that porch, in the dark, with the light clicking off above me, that I was done shaping myself into whatever was easiest for other people to swallow. What I have now is this. An office manager position I earned with my own 2 hands at 62 years old. A 2-bedroom apartment with a sage green room that gets used. A balcony herb garden that has, against all odds, kept a rosemary plant alive for over a year, which anyone who's tried to keep rosemary alive in an Ontario winter will tell you is its own small miracle. A standing Thursday dinner with 2 women from the clinic, who've become real friends, the kind who notice when you go quiet and ask why instead of letting it slide. And 2 grandchildren who are, slowly and on their own terms, finding their way back into a relationship with me that isn't filtered through anyone else's convenience. I don't tell you this story because I want pity. I've got a job I'm proud of and rosemary that won't quit, and a grandson who picked his own bed in my guest room. I'm doing just fine, thank you. I tell it because I know there's a woman out there right now, maybe your age, maybe younger, standing on some porch of her own, holding everything she has left in 2 suitcases, watching a light click off above her. I want her to know that the door closing isn't the end of the story. It only feels that way in the moment. Standing in the dark with your arms full and nowhere obvious to go. It wasn't the end for me. It was the beginning of the only life I've ever fully chosen for myself. If someone in your own family ever made you feel like there was no room for you, I'd like to know what you did with that. Tell me in the comments, because I've learned something in the last 18 months that I wish someone had told me decades ago. The people who close the door on you are very often the same people who are afraid of exactly who you'll become once you stop waiting for them to open it again.